Good morning, Mr. Green. Will you take the oath? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Good morning, Mr. Green. Your name is David Green?
That is correct.
May I ask how old you are?
I'm 64.
And until your retirement in August of last year, you were a Procurator Fiscal,
That is correct.
and you had been so for some 40 years.
I retired after 40 years and 1 day.
Mr. Green, there's a blue folder in front of you, and if you can open it up, in fact, I see you've already done that, I would like to go through the contents of that folder with you. The inquiry has, on 2 occasions, written to you under a procedure that we refer to as Rule 8, inviting your response to a number of questions set out in a letter. And you should have within that folder the first Rule 8 request. Its reference number, we don't need it on the screen, but its reference number is SBPI 00226. And there should also be your response to that first request, which we will bring up on the screen, although there is a hard copy in front of you, and it's SBPI 00227. Are both of those documents there in the folder, Mr. Green?
Yes.
Grand. So we've brought up your first Rule 8 response on the screen. This is, in effect, your statement to the inquiry. So if I slip into referring to it as your statement rather than your Rule 8 response, you'll know what I'm referring to. The pages, I don't think, are numbered, but if we scroll through to the very, very end, we'll see that it comprises 78 paragraphs and concludes with a form of words that I think was provided to you by the inquiry. I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. Do you see that, Mr. Green, on the final page?
Yes, indeed.
Now, if we scroll to the very bottom, we'll see that this page is dated 22nd of December 2022. Your signature has been redacted on the copy that's on the screen, but will hopefully be visible on the hard copy in your folder.
It is.
So when you signed this statement, you understood that it would form part of the evidence before the inquiry and would be available to the chair for his consideration.
I did.
And when you prepared that response, did you take care to be truthful and accurate in the answers that you gave to the questions?
Yes, I would say this, however, on review of the statement, and I have had a look at it obviously in the last couple of days, at one point in the statement I state that I had a discussion with Pat Campbell about the family's attitude to postmortem, and on mature reflection, that's not accurate. It was only Keith Harrower that I spoke to.
All right. Can we go perhaps then to paragraph 70? I think that's the paragraph that you have in mind.
Yes, that's correct.
Let's have a quick look at this. I recall a discussion with DSU Patrick Campbell regarding the family refusing to attend the mortuary to identify Mr. Bayoh. I believe I had a similar discussion with Keith Harrower. The content of that discussion and my decision and reasons for so deciding are set out earlier. So on mature reflection, as you put it, your recollection is that in fact you only spoke with Mr. Harrower and not with Mr. Campbell.
To be clear, I did speak to Mr. Campbell about other matters, but not about that. It was only Keith Harrower I spoke to about the families potentially identifying Mr. Bayoh.
Thank you for clarifying that. The inquiry then issued a second Rule 8 request. We don't need it on the screen, but it will be in your folder, SBPI 00434. And the response that you submitted to that request, which we will bring up on the screen, please, is SBPI 00426. Again, are both of those documents in your folder, Mr. Green?
They are.
So this I will refer to as your second inquiry statement. Again, if we scroll to the very, very end, this statement comprises 82 paragraphs, and it concludes with the form of words that we looked at a moment ago at the foot of your first statement. And again, your signature has been redacted, but would you kindly confirm for me that the version in front of you shows your signature on every page of the document?
It does.
And that it was signed in December of 2023?
That's correct.
And again, in preparing this statement, did you do your best to be truthful and accurate?
Indeed. And on review, I have no concerns about what is stated in it.
Grand. Now, from time to time, I will ask for paragraphs from one or other of these statements to be shown, and they'll come up on the screen in front of us. The hard copies are in that folder, Mr. Green, for you to refer to at any time if you would find that to be helpful when you give your evidence. And if there's anything that you would like to be put up on the screen, please just let me know, and we can arrange for that to be done. I understand that prior to your retirement in August of last year, you were the head of the Homicide and Major Crime Unit within Crown Office.
Yes, that's correct.
And prior to that, you had been the head of the Scottish Fatalities and Investigation Unit.
Yes, I was head of SFIU from 2012 until 2019.
So 7 years in that post before you became the head of Homicide and Major Crime.
Correct.
And we will be concerned today with the events of May of 2015. As at May of 2015, you were the head of SFIU.
That is correct.
I want to begin by asking you some questions about the role of the Fiscal and Deaths investigation, and if we could perhaps bring up your first statement and look at page 2, the paragraph at the top of the page, where you provide a little background information. You say the Lord Advocate has responsibility for the investigation of all sudden, unexpected, unexplained, uncertificated and suspicious deaths occurring in Scotland. In former times, the local Procurator Fiscal, as representative of the Lord Advocate, would be responsible for all such investigations. More recently, the service has been reorganised with specialist units brought into being with responsibility for specific areas of work, such as homicide, that's the homicide unit, and deaths investigation, that's SFIU. Staff in SFIU would receive reports of deaths from the police, medical practitioners, registrars of death, etc., and would take all necessary steps to investigate the death, such as instructing post-mortem examination, toxicology, and any other specialist reports. And you go on to explain how you can instruct the police to carry out investigations and bring to bear the expertise of other organisations such as the Health and Safety Executive, the AAIB, is that the Air Accidents Investigation Branch? Bureau.
It's Bureau, Air Accidents Investigation Bureau.
And RAIB, what's that?
Rail Accident Investigations Bureau.
Thank you. And take any other action required, and you explain that on completion of the investigation, the final report would be sent to Crown Office for Crown Counsel's instruction on whether or not a fatal accident inquiry should be held, and the decision whether to hold an FAI is entirely a matter for the Lord Advocate. So
Correct.
I wanted to ask you some further questions arising from my reading of that paragraph. You explained that the reorganisation within COPFS took place in 2012, and you mentioned the Homicide Unit and SFIU. Now, before that reorganisation, the local fiscal was responsible for deaths investigation. And I think you explain elsewhere in your statement that at an earlier stage in your career, in the 2000s, you had responsibility for the Glasgow Deaths Unit.
That's correct, for about 7 years.
7 years. So 7 years managing the Deaths Unit in Glasgow. You've told us that you were head of SFIU for a further 7 years. And then between 2019 and 2023, that's a further 4 years, you were head of the Homicide and Major Crime Unit.
Correct.
So if my maths is any good, that would be 18 years where your exclusive focus has been on the investigation of sudden, suspicious and unexpected deaths within one unit of Crown Office or another.
That's correct.
Are you able to say how many deaths you have investigated over the course of your career?
When I left SFIU, one of my team did some research and told me that I'd been responsible for over 100,000 deaths passing through the unit. Obviously, I did not investigate every single one of those, but I had significant involvement in large numbers, and obviously was the last decision maker in relation to any difficult cases that came up. I've investigated hundreds of murders. I've indicted hundreds of murders. It's deaths without number, frankly. I couldn't begin to guess, but thousands and thousands of them.
Are you able to say how many deaths in custody or deaths following police contact you've investigated over the course of your career?
Deaths in custody, I think probably, if there's a distinction, is it deaths in custody in prisons or deaths in custody in police custody? So in police custody, I think probably about 7. In prisons, significantly more than that.
Thank you. Returning to the text on the screen, you explain here that staff in SFIU would receive reports of deaths from the police, from medical practitioners, from registrars, and would take all necessary steps to investigate the death. And you go on to list the sorts of steps that you might take. Can you help us to understand the purpose of SFIU investigating the deaths that are reported to it?
Deaths investigations in SFIU would include the unexpected, the unexplained, and the uncertificated. Suspicious deaths generally would go to homicide, although there is a crossover insofar as a death might start off looking suspicious and quickly become non-suspicious once a postmortem had taken place or some other evidence had come to light. So that would transfer, we would transfer between the two units. So it's in dealing with the deaths that are unexpected, unexplained, and uncertificated, no one can be buried or cremated or remains disposed of in any other way without there being a death certificate. And a very significant number of these deaths would be cases where doctors weren't prepared to provide a certificate of cause of death, and we would then have to carry out examinations to obtain a certificate. Now, sometimes that was done by discussion and explanation to doctors, and they would ultimately provide a certificate, but more often than not, we would carry out a postmortem. So to put it in context, I think the average number of deaths that SFIU would deal with during my tenure would be about 12 to 13,000. Out of that, we would instruct about 6,800 postmortems. We would then have a diminishing number of cases that would require full investigation, so probably somewhere about 700 per annum.
Thank you. Just to be clear, the figures that you've shared with us, are they per annum or over the course of
that's per annum, yes,
annum.
per annum.
So you say that within SFIU, you would be responsible for the unexpected, unexplained and uncertificated deaths. Those that had the hallmarks of being homicidal would go directly to the homicide unit. For members of the public who are perhaps listening to your evidence, can you give us examples of the sorts of deaths that the SFIU might have reported to it?
As I say, any death where there was no death certificate, any death that resulted from an accident. Part of SFIU was at that time the road traffic fatalities investigation units. Road traffic fatalities were part of it. Ultimately, they transferred to homicide, so I took them over again at a later point. All deaths in prison custody would be reported to us. Any death in police custody. Anything at all that is sudden, unexpected, unexplained, accidental that needed to be dealt with. Literally, almost any kind of death, to be honest. It's I'm sorry to put it that way, but that is the fact of the matter.
And what would be the ultimate purpose of your unit taking on the responsibility for investigating that death?
Well, the purpose in relation to those deaths that are uncertificated and eventually get a medical certificate of cause of death that allows the body to be disposed of, there would be no further purpose to that. in a case of an accident, a road traffic accident, an accident at work, something of that nature, the purpose is to find out why the accident happened and to prepare to, if appropriate, to have a fatal accident inquiry so that a sheriff could determine the cause of death and the cause of any accident that resulted in the death and potentially make recommendations that might prevent future deaths.
And should we understand that the inquiries that you might instruct would depend very much on the circumstances of the death?
Yes, they're entirely case specific.
You give some examples in this paragraph where you say that you might instruct postmortem examination, toxicology, other specialist reports, that you can instruct the police to carry out investigations on your behalf. You can seek specialist medical reports and reports from the other organisations that we have discussed. And these are but examples, I think, of the sorts of powers that the Fiscal has to investigate a death that's unexpected, unexplained or uncertificated.
Yes.
Tell me, Mr. Green, what happens when a death occurs out with office hours?
It depends on the type of death. If it's a homicidal death, then it would be reported directly to the homicide on-call fiscal. Any other death would have come to me because there was no on-call provision for SFIU, so I was in effect on-call all the time. It has to be said that not a great number of such deaths would be reported. There was no provision, say, for example, for general practitioners to call in deaths 24 hours a day. But deaths after police contact or a death in custody police custody would be reported to me out of hours.
So if the death was an uncertificated one where the GP didn't feel they could issue a death certificate, you wouldn't be troubled by the GP over the weekend. That might wait until, say, the Monday morning. But if it was an unexpected or unexplained death, or there was any concern around the circumstances, then you would be contacted out of office hours.
Yes, that's correct, and also for all cases of organ donation.
You've explained that you were on cover all the time. I think, as you put it in your statement, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Can you help us to understand just how often you were in fact contacted out of office hours?
There was no typical week, but what I can say is that I never managed to see a single one of my son's rugby games right through on a Saturday morning because invariably I was called about something and had to leave the other parents and go to somewhere quiet to take the call. So it was, I would imagine, maybe 30, 40 times at the weekend over the course of a year, something like that.
Sorry, is that 30, 40 times over the course of a 12-month period?
Yes, yes.
Okay, not 30 to 40 calls on a single weekend?
No, not at all. And some weeks you might get a huge number of calls for organ donation or whatever other reason, and other times it's quiet. It's entirely unexpected. The phone rings and your heart sinks, to be frank.
So every week would be different. There was no such thing as a typical week, but if you were to average it out, just to give us a feel for the level of commitment, it would be 30 to 40 calls per annum.
Yes.
Am I right to understand that as a fiscal and indeed as an on-call fiscal, you had a number of resources available to you, provided by the Crown Office?
I had a mobile phone, which had an ability to send and receive emails. For major incidents, major disasters, I had a folder that I prepared for myself and various items of on-call kit, but really nothing beyond that.
Okay. And in terms of the Crown Office publications, would you have had access to, for example, the Deaths Manual of Practice?
No, not normally. I could have printed it out and taken it home, but I didn't do that. I didn't feel the need to.
I mean, you are a very experienced fiscal, but did you contribute to the writing of the Deaths Manual of Practice?
Yes, myself and a colleague wrote them.
Right. All right. So it might not be something that you would need to hand as a ready reckoner if you were responsible for the content.
I certainly didn't feel the need to do so. Had I felt the need, I would have printed them out. But sometimes I would get calls from other fiscals throughout the country who would have been contacted by the police about a death when they shouldn't necessarily have gone to them rather than me, and I would give advice to them. So I was immersed in it.
All right. Just for completeness, should we understand that there is a deaths manual of practice that's published by the Crown Office?
Yes.
It's available as a resource to fiscals, presumably on your intranet, but in printable format if you wanted to take it home for on-call purposes. Are there also Crown Office circulars that might bear on the subject of death investigation?
Yes, and even some other things going back further to the Book of Regulations. So there's a lot of information there, and we would train new entrants into SFIU on that.
And finally, was there also something called Serious and Complex Case Guidance, Preliminary Investigation of Suspicious Deaths and On-Call Duties?
Yes.
And is that a document that you're familiar with?
Yes.
Did you play any part in authoring that document?
Not that I recall.
All right. I want to ask some questions about the instruction of post-mortem examinations in a very general sense. Can you help those listening to your evidence to understand in what circumstances the fiscal would instruct an autopsy? In a case of a death arising out of an accident or from a homicidal act, the fiscal would always instruct a two-doctor post-mortem. As I've said, in relation to SFIU deaths where the death is unexplained or uncertificated, sometimes it was possible to speak to the doctor to say, what is your concern here, and get them to provide a certificate. If no certificate was forthcoming, we would instruct a single doctor post-mortem simply to obtain an MCCD that allowed the death to be registered. That's a medical certificate of cause of death. All right. You said in any homicidal death, you would instruct two doctors.
Correct.
Is that for reasons of corroboration?
Indeed, absolutely. And it goes without saying that that also applies to those deaths where there is a potential for a fatal accident inquiry, because once again, you're looking for that requirement of corroboration.
Would that include a death in custody?
Absolutely.
Whereas I understand it, there's a mandatory requirement for a
It
fatal
is
accident inquiry.
a mandatory inquiry.
And typically, after a death has been notified to the fiscal, how soon does the autopsy take place?
It's important to have the autopsy at the earliest possible time. That's where you get the best examination. It's most likely that the results won't be corrupted. When I was first a deputy, and for many years when I was doing on-call for homicide in Glasgow 30 plus years ago, we would do post-mortem examinations in such cases more or less immediately. The body would be taken straight to the mortuary and a post-mortem would happen at all hours of the day and night, weekends included. That has slightly changed, but we would still be trying to have a post-mortem as quickly as possible. So unfortunately, pathologists are a very limited resource. Mortuaries are a similarly limited resource. There are not infrequently delays in dealing with what perhaps it's the wrong word to use, but the routine deaths, the deaths where you're simply seeking an MCCD. Different criteria apply where you are looking at a homicide or something akin to that, where you'd be seeking to have the pathologist deal with that post-mortem as soon as possible, at the earliest possible time they could undertake the examination. So that's dependent on mortuary availability, and it's dependent on there being two suitably qualified forensic pathologists available to carry out the examination.
You said that an autopsy, and in particular a homicidal autopsy, should take place at the earliest possible time to minimise, I think you said, the risk of corruption of the evidence. Sorry,
Yes.
I don't have access to the transcript while we're speaking. Can you elaborate on that, please? Explain a little more what you mean by that.
Well, bodies deteriorate from the moment of death. the natural breakdown of the body that occurs in every case starts immediately. So, for example, it's not uncommon in a post-mortem that's delayed to find post-mortem alcohol, which the body generates itself. It's not a reflection of alcohol that's been consumed by the deceased, it's alcohol that has been generated in the body. Marks can be less visible, they can deteriorate, you can end up with all sorts of issues if there's a delay in the examination. So any death where an individual is found after a period of time after death, it's a more difficult post-mortem because of the degeneration of the body tissues.
I'd like to ask you some questions, again general questions at this stage around identification of a body, and if we could turn to paragraph 72 of your statement, please. Oh, I'm sorry, this may be the second statement. It's got the paragraph numbers enumerated.
I think it's the first statement.
No, sorry, it is the first statement. Thank you. Yes, in the first statement there's a lengthy passage which doesn't have a paragraph number, and then towards the end of the statement there are paragraph numbers. So it's page 12.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Green. So page 12 of the first statement, and it's paragraph 72. Here you explain that as part of the post-mortem process, the Fiscal must ensure that the deceased is properly identified. Often that is by visual identification by friends or relatives, but other means, such as fingerprints, DNA, and odontology, can be used. It is a matter for the Fiscal to decide the means of identification, dependent on the circumstances of the death and the condition of the body. There are international standards for this. A body is not released until identification is certain. In what circumstances would you instruct identification by visual means through friends or relatives? Would that be the first port of call in an ordinary case?
Historically, certainly yes. It's my understanding that following the pandemic, the Fiscals are moving to try to identify by other means rather than having nearest relatives attend at the mortuary and go through what is potentially and very likely a trauma in having to identify. So we seek to have visual identification less and less, and in some cases visual identification is simply not possible because of the nature of the injuries that the deceased has suffered. I would say historically, and certainly at the time of Mr. Bayoh's death, it would be normal practice to seek to have nearest relatives identified.
And would it only be in a case where, for whatever reason, that wasn't possible or desirable, that you would move to looking to establish identification via fingerprints, DNA, or odontology?
At that time, yes, but as I say, I think things are moving towards a less, a more scientific identification rather than a visual.
I want to ask a few questions around the role of the Fiscal and Family liaison, again, just by way of setting the scene and background. If we can scroll to paragraph 45, please, of this statement. The role of, sorry, I'll let you find that in your hard copy.
Got it, thanks.
Got it. The role of COPFS and family liaison begins at the point of handover from the flows assigned to the family. In the greatest majority of cases, these are police flows, but in a small number of cases, they will be from PERC. In most cases, a flow or victim information and advice, that's via handover, takes place shortly after an individual has been charged and appeared in court. VIA staff are part of COPFS. In certain cases where a prosecution will not take place, the handover happens at a suitable point after the case has been reported to us. Such cases might be where no action is contemplated or possible, or an FAI is in contemplation. So the handover from the flows, whether it's police flows or PERC flows, is to VIA, Victim Information and Advice.
Yes.
Can you tell us just a little bit about the Victim Information and Advice service within the Crown Office?
There are really two levels of victim information and advice. Some deal with summary cases where they're simply telephoning and updating victims of crime about what has happened in the court that day, or bail status, something like that. But in deaths cases, there are more highly trained victim information and advice officers who will take to do with the family's meetings. They'll meet with family, they'll explain the process, they'll find out from the family what sort of contact they wish, whether that's in person, by telephone, on Teams or whatever, and they will keep the family abreast of developments throughout the whole process of the case, so through the investigative process up to the conclusion of a trial, if there is such a thing, or the end of an FAI, if that's the ultimate outcome. Clearly, not all cases end up in court, so they're also dealing with them till there's a point where there's an explanation, probably in the presence of the VIA officer, but carried out by an investigator in SFIU or one of the fiscals in SFIU, where it's explained to the family that our investigations have come to an end and why that has happened.
Thank you. And you say that in a case involving criminality, the point of handover will ordinarily be when the individual has been charged and appeared in court, and in other cases it would be after the matter has been reported to the Crown Office. Can we take it that could be weeks or months later, weeks or months after the death?
No, not. I wouldn't suggest it would be weeks or months. Flows, FLO officers in the police and indeed in PERC are again a very limited resource. There are very, very few of these individuals who are highly trained to carry out that role. So in something like a major disaster, it's a real problem to have enough flows to actually deal with the number of deceased that you're facing. So you know, the role of the flow is to get in, to meet the family, to support them in the early stages of the investigation, but they would be seeking to get out of that and pass that responsibility to the Crown at the earliest opportunity, so they can go on to the next case, so to speak. So it varies depending on the nature of the investigation. You know, some cases where there is plainly a homicide, there may not be an individual identified as the perpetrator, and that would mean that the flow involvement would be extended potentially for a very long time. There are some unsolved cases that I'm aware of, they're solved now, but flows were engaged with the family over a period of years. Now, that contact was not constant, but they maintained a relationship with them. So it's all case dependent, to be frank.
All case dependent. But in the ordinary course of things, with, say, a death in custody, would there ever be a role for VIA, in your experience, before the point that the matter is reported to the Crown Office by the PERC?
There might be a handover from PERC flows to VIA once they have reached a point in their investigation that all sides are confident that more or less what has happened is understood and that it can then be passed over. But again, I don't know what happened in this case. I have no knowledge of that.
Do VIA provide a service out with office hours?
No.
I want to move on to asking questions again, general questions about the role of the Fiscal in directing the investigation into the circumstances of a death in police custody. So if we could stay with your first statement, please, and look at page 2. Paragraphs 3 and 4. Before the advent of Police Scotland, it was open to the Procurator Fiscal, in consultation with the local Chief Constable, to instruct an outside force to investigate any death in police custody. When Police Scotland were established, it was necessary for the role of the PERC to be extended to include an investigative role in order that they could independently investigate any death in police custody or following contact with the police. In advance of Police Scotland coming into being in 2013 and having regard to the enhanced role of the PERC, meetings had to be held involving Crown Office, the police and PERC to establish the process for dealing with deaths in custody of the police or following contact with the police in order that all organisations understood their role. I was involved in these discussions along with my then colleague Kate Frame, who was head of the criminal complaints against the police division at Crown Office. And I'll stop there because I don't think we need to concern ourselves with the remainder of that paragraph for now. So you go on, however, to say that a procedure that was agreed was that in such cases it would be the Professional Standards Department of Police Scotland who would contact you or your deputy, such that you might consider whether the PERC should be instructed to investigate or whether the investigation should be left with Police Scotland. Was that the mechanism that was put in place?
Yes, indeed.
And you say too that not all deaths following police contact require to be independently investigated, but all deaths in police custody do. Can you explain, please, to anyone who's listening what the difference is between a death in custody and a death following police contact?
Well, as I indicated earlier, a death in custody is a mandatory fatal accident inquiry, so that requires to be independently investigated with a view to the FAI further down the line. In relation to a death after police contact, it very much depends on the scenarios. So, for example, I might get a telephone call from the professional standards out of hours to tell me that, and this happened frequently in the early days before we sort of established what the parameters were. I would get calls to say, we were in contact with this deceased individual 9 months ago, for example, about a certain thing, and there was no nexus whatever between the earlier contact and the death, and I would decline to become involved in those circumstances. So again, it would very much depend on the nature of the contact, and if I felt it was necessary and appropriate, I would instruct PERC to investigate.
As you said a moment ago, all deaths in police custody require to be independently investigated, and there would be a mandatory fatal accident inquiry, and it's the PERC who would be instructed by you to carry out that investigation.
Yes.
For completeness, we've heard evidence that the legislation that gives you the authority to instruct the PERC to investigate a death in police custody is the Police, Public Order and Criminal Justice Scotland Act 2006, and it's section 33 capital A, subparagraph B2. Is that correct?
B1 and 2, I think.
Well, I wondered whether the Act, by virtue of B1, also gives the authority to carry out an investigation where there's an indication that a police officer may have committed an offence.
Yes.
So a B1 instruction would be in relation to potential criminality, and a B2 instruction would be in relation to a death following or a death in police custody, amongst other things.
Yes, a death the Fiscal has to investigate. Yes, that's correct.
Yes, I'm using a shorthand, but just to understand that there is a distinction in the legislation in terms of which provision the instruction would be issued to the PERC under, depending on whether you're instructing the PERC to investigate a death in police custody or a suspicion of criminality on the part of a police officer.
Indeed.
I want to move on now to ask some questions about your involvement following the death of Sheikha Bayoh on the 3rd of May of 2015. And I wonder if we might look at the first page of your first statement. Beg your pardon, it's page 3 of your first statement. And it's the final paragraph on that page. There we are, on Sunday, 3rd of May. On Sunday, 3rd May 2015, I received a telephone call from the on-call senior officer at Professional Standards Police Scotland. I cannot now recall who this was. I was advised that an incident resulting in a death in custody had occurred in Kirkcaldy. I was advised that at about 7:15 hours, police had received calls from the public alerting them to a black male, stripped to the waist, brandishing a knife and approaching members of the public in cars. My recollection was that he was said to have banged the knife on the roof of a car being driven by a nurse on her way to work. I was advised that officers had been detailed to search for this male and that 4 police vehicles containing 7 officers had located the man. On approaching him, he had run at the officers and a struggle ensued. If we can scroll down, please, onto the top of the next page. I was advised that he had struck a female officer, but that this was not with a knife. I was told that pava spray had been used, but that this had no effect, that the man had been struck with batons, and that during the restraint, handcuffs and leg restraints had been utilised. I was told that during this the male had collapsed and CPR had been commenced by police officers and continued by ambulance personnel who were called to the scene. The man, who was named as Sheikh Bayoh, was conveyed to the Victoria Infirmary Kirkcaldy, where he received treatment, but despite the efforts of medical personnel, he had succumbed. Now, you say in your statement, Mr. Green, that you can't recall who called you. We heard evidence from Pat Campbell, the SIO, that it may have been a Superintendent Craig Blackhall, who was on call for professional standards, who made contact with you. Does that jog your memory at all?
It certainly was Craig Blackhall, because, again, I've been thinking about this, as you would anticipate, and I did recall that it was Craig Blackhall who called me. I hadn't remembered that at the time of preparing the statement.
Do you recall what time he called you?
I think it was about 9 o'clock.
Now, the inquiry may have before it an email, which I'm afraid I'm not in a position to put on the screen just now, from Craig Blackhall to others, which tends to suggest that he might have called you at about 9:25 a.m. Would you take any issue with that?
I wouldn't take any issue with that. I know I was immediately trying to speak to Perk, and I spoke to them at about 9:30, so that may very well be absolutely accurate.
You explain in your statement, we don't need to go to the paragraph, but you do explain that you took notes at the time that you received the call, but you cannot now locate them. And you've provided here quite a detailed description of the information that was provided to you some years ago now. And I wanted to ask, have you provided that account from your memory?
Yes, I suppose it's appropriate to say this, that there were a lot of phone calls, and I was given different little bits of information at different times. And at this remove, I can't be absolutely certain what bit of information I received at what point in time. But I do know that when Superintendent Blackhall called me, he advised me that it had happened about 7:15, that there was a black male, that a knife had been involved, that there was the police were sent to search for him. There'd been this altercation, and the other elements of CPR, etc., were all given at that time.
Okay. If we could scroll back up a little bit so that we're looking at the final paragraph on page 3, please. There's a reference here about halfway down to the black male being stripped to the waist and otherwise bare-chested. I just wondered how confident you were in your recollection that that information had been provided to you by Mr. Blackhall at that time.
I can't swear to that, I'm afraid. I was certainly told that at some point. I think it was at that point, but I really couldn't be absolutely sure at this remove, and without access to my contemporaneous notes.
In the very final line of text there's a reference to Mr. Bayoh running at the officers. Again, is that information that you are confident you were provided with by Craig Blackhall or perhaps someone else?
I can't be sure if it was Craig Blackhall who said that, but certainly that he told me there had been a confrontation between the individual and police officers. That part may have come later. To be honest, as I say, there were many calls.
I appreciate there were many calls and it was many years ago now, but should we understand that your evidence is that at some stage you were told that Mr. Bayoh was stripped to the waist?
Yes.
And that at some stage that you were told that the officers attended, located him, and on approaching him, he ran at the officers?
Yes.
If we can go to page 4 of your statement, please. And it's the 3rd paragraph down. I informed the officer, and this would be Craig Blackhall, I think,
Yes.
that I intended to refer the matter to Perk, who would take over the investigation. I was also advised that it appeared Mr. Bayoh had been watching a boxing match earlier in the morning with friends, and that there had been some sort of altercation between them. I instructed that Police Scotland could carry on investigating this earlier incident, but that the circumstances leading up to his death were to be investigated by the Perk. You go on to say in the next paragraph, I then tried to contact the Perk on-call number. My recollection is that the call went to voicemail, and I asked to be called back. I then called my colleague Stephen McGowan and made him aware of the circumstances as I understood them, that I was referring the matter to Perk and would also take steps to arrange a 2-doctor post-mortem. I was concerned that the Crown Agent, law officers and other colleagues be made aware of this, as I anticipated media interest in what was obviously a high-profile incident. So I wanted to ask you some questions arising from these paragraphs in your statement. You said, I think, a few moments ago that it was about 9:30 that you called Perk.
Yes.
Is that right? You obviously left a message and I think perhaps spoke with Perk a short time later. Was it 9:30 that you called and left a message, or was it 9:30 that you spoke to someone at Perk, do you recall?
I can't say.
Okay. You said you called the Perk on-call number. Is that a number that you'd ever had occasion to use before?
I'd used it many times.
Was it usual for it to go to voicemail?
No, but at that time in the morning, potentially someone's in the shower. I thought nothing of it. Normally, the call would be picked up immediately, and that phone was passed around the on-call Perk investigators, so it was a number I was familiar with.
Was there much of a lapse of time between you calling and leaving the message and you speaking with someone from Perk?
I don't think there was much lapse of time at all.
You mentioned there your colleague Stephen McGowan. Who's Stephen McGowan, or what was his role at the time?
Stephen McGowan was my immediate senior officer, so to speak, based in Crown Office, and who had responsibility for some of the specialist units, in particular at that time SFIU, also homicide and other units.
Is that why you were calling him, just to make him aware?
Yes, I thought that he needed to be made aware immediately, and I was concerned to ensure that such information as we had was passed on to the Crown Agent, law officers, etc., in order that there was knowledge of this potentially before it hit the media.
Yes. And you say that you anticipated the matter being high profile. You say, I anticipated media interest in what was obviously a high profile incident. What aspect of the circumstances as they were made known to you made you anticipate a high profile and media interest in the case?
Well, my entire role was to deal with deaths investigations, and as a consequence of that, I maintained an interest in deaths that were happening elsewhere in the United Kingdom, deaths that were happening abroad. I was aware that there had been a very high-profile matter in America where an individual who was black had died again at the hands of white police officers. I was aware of similar cases that had occurred in England. It seemed to me very obvious that this would be a matter of significant concern, given Mr. Bayoh was black and the officers were, I assumed, white.
The case that you mentioned in the USA, where about in America was that?
Oh gosh, at this remove I can't say. I think it might have been Baltimore, but I'm not 100% certain, and there have of course been many other cases since.
Can we look at the final paragraph on page 4, please? At about 9:30, I made contact with Keith Harrower, senior investigator at Perk, who was on call. I made him aware of the circumstances and instructed that Perk should investigate the incident from the point of the reports coming into the police about his behaviour till his being confirmed dead at the hospital. That the police would investigate the matters that occurred elsewhere, earlier that morning, as they did not appear connected, and that I would arrange a 2-doctor post-mortem. I confirmed that the body was at the Victoria Infirmary and would be transferred to Edinburgh City Mortuary for examination. I also advised that all officers involved were either at or at or on their way to Kirkcaldy Police Office, where a post-incident management process would take place. So this was your first direct contact with Perk. You spoke with Keith Harrower and gave him instructions to investigate from the time that reports were received by the police up to the point of death, and that the police would investigate the matters earlier that morning. So the investigation was effectively being split between the Perk and Police Scotland. And you provide an explanation for that in your second statement. I think I can probably just read this out to you because it's short. For your benefit, it's at paragraph 8 of your second statement. You say, I also instructed the police should investigate earlier incidents and alleged drug taking, as at that time they did not appear directly related, and in truth I had concerns about the Perk's ability to staff a potentially large inquiry, given they're a small organisation. And you reiterate that at paragraph 16 of your second statement, where you say, I was concerned not to overwhelm the Perk's limited resources. Can you help me to understand what your concerns were around the Perk's resources?
Well, it was a holiday weekend in the west of Scotland, in fact probably all Scotland other than Edinburgh. I knew that Perk would have to assemble staff who were not on call, so there may be difficulties in them getting those staff together. They then would have to travel a significant distance to get to Kirkcaldy. I was area fiscal in Fife for a period, so I know how long that journey takes. And it seemed to me that I also knew that Perk were a small organisation. They did not have large numbers of investigators. In my view, given the information I had, I was told that there had been a boxing match on in the middle of the night, that Mr. Bayoh and others had been watching that there had then been some fallout or other and some altercation had taken place. That appeared to be quite distinct and separate from what I was being told had happened during the period that the police were aware of something going on, i.e. from the time they started to get calls through to the point where Mr. Bayoh had died. And I felt the two things could easily be separated. For that matter, they could be brought back together again later, as in fact transpired. But it was to try to allow Perk to get proper resources to start investigating the death, which was the really important issue for me.
Did you discuss your concern around resourcing with Keith Harrower?
No, I don't recall that I did.
If Perk had more in the way of resourcing than they did at that point in 2015, would you have been inclined to instruct them to investigate the matter in its entirety?
To be honest, I really don't know what the answer to that is. As I say, the information that I had from professional standards suggested that what had taken place earlier was distant in time and place from what had occurred involving the police and Mr. Bayoh. So I might still have made the same decision, and I certainly separated investigations in other cases where it seemed appropriate to do so, where the matters, where there's a disjunct, if I can put it that way, between the issues.
Thank you. If we can look at page 5 of your statement, paragraph 2, please. You say, I next called back the officer from Police Professional Standards, that would be Craig Blackhall. Sorry, I'll just let you find that. This is your first statement,
yes,
page
I
5.
have it.
You got it. The paragraph at the top of the page. I next called back the officer from Police Professional Standards, who we know as Craig Blackhall, advising him of Keith Harrower's identity and contact details, and confirmed my instructions. I was advised senior officers were aware and that a handover to Perk would be facilitated. Were you advised when that handover was likely going to take place?
No, there was no discussion about that, and plainly no handover really could take place until Perk had managed to get on the ground in Kirkcaldy. It was a matter for Keith Harrower and his staff, as well as the police, to arrange that at an appropriate and convenient time.
Okay. And what were your expectations in terms of the timescale for Keith Harrower and his team mobilising and getting to Kirkcaldy?
I doubted that Keith would go on his own. I anticipated he would certainly wish to have someone else with him to act as a noter, if nothing else. I thought that might take about an hour to get organised and a couple of hours to travel there, so I was anticipating that there would be at least some PERC staff on the ground within a period of about 3 hours, but I believe I made it very clear that I wanted them to get to Kirkcaldy and take control of this as quickly as they possibly could.
So by 9 o'clock, or by 9:30 or by shortly after 9:30, you'd been notified of the death. You'd taken the decision to instruct the PERC to investigate from the time that the reports were received to the point of death, and that the police would investigate the earlier events. You'd advised the PERC of your instruction, you'd advised professional standards of your instruction, and you'd taken steps to advise colleagues within the Crown Office and ensure that the law officers and the Crown Agent were aware of the death. And I think you explain in your statement, we don't need to go to it, but that you followed up these various instructions with emails.
Yes. I said them by BlackBerry.
And in particular, you mention sending an email to the PERC making clear that the basis of your instruction was that they should investigate a death in custody as opposed to an instruction to investigate criminality.
Yes, I instructed PERC in terms of 33A to investigate the death.
And you explain in your second statement, paragraph 4, it's a short paragraph, we may not need to bring it up, but you explain that at the time of your original instruction, you did not consider that you had any indication that a person serving with the police may have committed an offence.
That is correct.
Okay. And that was the reason for the instruction being to investigate a death in custody rather than criminality.
Indeed.
Can we return to, we're on page 5, the bottom of page 5, please, where you go on to explain the arrangements that you then put in place for the conduct of an autopsy. And you say, I then spent some considerable time making arrangements for the transfer of the body to Edinburgh, for 2 forensic pathologists to conduct the examination, and that a KSAR examination would be utilised in advance of the PM. As 4th May was a public holiday in Glasgow, I also arranged that an experienced colleague from the Edinburgh office, Bernard Ablett, on call for homicides in East Scotland, would attend the PM. So I wanted to ask some questions around that. You say you made arrangements for the transfer of the body to Edinburgh. What did those arrangements involve?
That was an instruction to the police to have their undertaker, and they have a contract for moving bodies around, available to transport the body, and that it required to go to Edinburgh City Mortuary for examination. The movement of that body would be in control of PERC. I expected PERC would take control of the body at the Victoria Infirmary in Kirkcaldy, so the timing of that was not set down. It was simply that this required to happen, and the body had to be in Edinburgh effectively that day, so that it was available for post-mortem process starting at about 12 noon the following day.
You mention contact with the 2 forensic pathologists and also the KSAR examination. What arrangements are in place for contacting a pathologist out of hours?
Generally speaking, on-call homicide deputies would go through police force control to contact them, because they keep a note of who the on-call pathologists are. My recollection is that I knew it was Kerry-Ann Shearer who was on call, and I know all the forensic pathologists very well, so I had all their telephone numbers anyway, so I simply called her directly to ask about mortuary capacity, mortuary availability, the availability of another pathologist, and indeed whether she herself could do the examination on the Monday, because it might have been that she had a court commitment or something else. So it was to arrange 2 pathologists and the mortuary. So I would do that via Kerry-Ann. She would then contact the mortuary and tell them to expect this deceased coming from Kirkcaldy, and that it was a criminal justice post-mortem process. So there are arrangements that need to be put in place to ensure that body is not brought into contact with other bodies and all of those sorts of things to avoid cross-contamination.
Tell us more about the conversation that you had with Dr. Shearer in terms of setting up the arrangements for the autopsy. You asked about her availability, you asked whether a second forensic pathologist could be available. You've mentioned already, and we will come to this, that the autopsy started at midday on the 4th. Had you suggested to her that you wanted the autopsy to take place the following day, and bearing in mind what you said earlier about the desirability of conducting an autopsy as soon as possible?
I simply asked her what the earliest time an autopsy could be conducted was, and that was dependent, as I say, on mortuary capacity and the availability of the forensic pathologists. I certainly made it clear, not that I think I needed to Kerry Ann, that this was a case that had to be done as quickly as possible, given the circumstances, given it was a death in custody, and we needed to know what had caused Mr. Bayoh's death.
You said a moment ago you made it clear to Dr. Shearer that this was an autopsy that had to be conducted as quickly as possible given the circumstances. By that, do you mean because this was the death of a man, perhaps even a black man, in police custody?
No, it was the death of a man who had died while in custody of police officers. It mattered not that Mr. Bayoh was black. That wasn't the issue at all. The issue was that we needed to know whether this man's death had been brought about by acts of the police officers.
So that was the imperative for the early post-mortem. Over and above what you said earlier about a body begins to
Yes.
decompose from the moment of death, and so there's a desirability in any case to perform the autopsy as quickly as possible. But the imperative in this case was that this had been a death in custody, and you needed to know whether that death had been brought about by the actions of the police officers.
Or indeed whether he might have died of natural causes. It was essential to know, as best we could from the post-mortem, why Mr. Bayoh had died. That's the foundation stone upon which the entire investigation is built, and without that it's difficult to see what you investigate or how, because you simply do not have any idea why he's died. And I was given information sometime during the day, I'm sure I discussed this with Kerry Ann, that he didn't appear to have any bleeding injuries. There was nothing obvious that had been found at the Victoria Infirmary. Now, I'm sure that must have come from the E&E doctors who had tried to save his life. But I certainly was left in a situation where there was nothing obvious that could account for his death, and it seemed essential to get that information at the earliest possible time.
You mentioned there quasar. What's that?
Quasar is a light source that can be used to bring up markings on a body that are not necessarily obvious to the naked eye. So it will show underlying bruising, for example. And in this particular case, the reason that I instructed a quasar examination was, in discussion with Dr. Shearer, I explained that Mr. Bayoh was black. She expressed a concern that that might make seeing bruising on the body more difficult, and suggested that to assist her and her colleague, we should have a quasar examination. That seemed eminently sensible to me, so I instructed quasar B be deployed.
You mention arranging for Bernard Ablett, who was on call for homicides in the east of Scotland, to attend the autopsy, given you were on a public holiday and he, being in Edinburgh, wasn't. Help us to understand, what's the Fiscal's role at an autopsy?
The Fiscal's role in any sudden, suspicious death, rather than sudden, in a suspicious death, is to attend to ensure that the autopsy is conducted appropriately, that appropriate samples are taken, that the labels attached to the samples are all signed, but also to get a readout from the forensic pathologists at the end of the examination as to what their findings are. Now, that's not binding them to those findings. Sometimes they will express a view, well, I think this, but I'll need to do some histology, I'll need to do some lab work before I come to a concluded view, but these are my findings at this point in time. Thus, to give the Crown Office an understanding of what it is we're actually looking at.
Was it during the course of your call with Dr. Shearer that you agreed with her that there was capacity, there were 2 forensic pathologists available, and that the autopsy would commence at 12 o'clock the following day?
Yes, I'm not sure if there was more than one call. I'm not sure if Kerry Ann had to check with the mortuary, but whatever, we came to that view, and there were 2 pathologists available. There was a space in the mortuary at that point. When you're doing a suspicious death, it's essential that the mortuary be cleaned entirely before you start it. You can't just go in and carry out that examination where you've perhaps done 8, 10 routine postmortems earlier in the day. So there's a process where the pathologist will deal with the cause of death examinations, then the mortuary will be fully cleaned in order to preserve any evidence that might be recovered during that process. So it's not just as simple as saying, you know, we expect to finish it at 11:30, so we'll start again at 11:45. There's a process that has to be gone through.
Right. Do you recall what time it was that you had this conversation or these conversations with Dr. Shearer?
I would be guessing, saying somewhere around about 10:30-ish. I do remember after the initial burst of telephone calls and quick emails, which I felt had to go immediately, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat down for a few minutes because it was a bit frantic, to be frank. So I then started those other calls. I had no idea when I phoned Dr. Shearer whether we would be looking at Monday or Tuesday or potentially even a later date in the week. But I was concerned, as I've indicated, to do this as quickly as possible.
Okay. So by the time you had this call, I appreciate you might be guessing here, but you think maybe 10, half 10.
It was certainly during the morning.
Okay. During the morning of the 3rd, or let's say by lunchtime on the 3rd, the autopsy had been scheduled for lunchtime on the 4th. Would that be a reasonable way of putting it?
Correct.
Now, at that point in time when you finalised or put in place these arrangements for the autopsy, did you know whether the death message had been delivered to Mr. Bayoh's family?
I did not know that.
Did you know whether police flows had been appointed?
I had no knowledge of that. I had no real knowledge of what was going on in Kirkcaldy at all.
Okay. Did you know whether perk flows had been appointed?
No.
Do you know whether perk flows were even on duty on the Sunday?
No.
No.
I was totally unaware of that, and the deployment of perk flows would be a matter for Mr. Harrower.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that it would be a matter for him, but I'm wondering whether in your arrangements to schedule the autopsy, you took into account the need for the perk and the police between them to notify Mr. Bayoh's family of the death, to appoint flows, for the flows to meet with the family and explain the necessity for the post-mortem. Whether you factored in the need for these things to happen to the schedule that you had put in place.
Well, I made both Police Scotland and Mr. Harrower aware of the arrangements. They expressed no concern about that. I would have anticipated that the police would have contacted Mr. Bayoh's family and given a death message really as soon as they possibly could. Now, there are difficulties with a death message because the amount of information that's available and the circumstances may be a problem, but you still need to tell them that this has happened. And I fully anticipated and expected that PERC would make themselves known to the family and explain the circumstances and explain the need for a post-mortem and the timetabling of that post-mortem at the earliest opportunity.
So those were your expectations, both of the police and of the PERC, but was there any discussion on the morning of the 3rd with Craig Blackhall from the Professional Standards Department within Police Scotland or Mr Harrower from the PERC as to what your expectations were?
Certainly not with Craig Blackhall. I didn't. I don't think I discussed anything further with him, to be frank. But I certainly had discussions with Keith Harrower, and he would have been in no doubt that my expectations were that the family would be told about this at the earliest possible time and made aware of the arrangements for the post-mortem and asked if they would be willing to attend to identify Mr Bayoh. It had happened that way in so many other cases, and to be honest, Keith Harrower, with his experience, and he and I worked together on a number of different investigations, I don't know there was a need to go into it in any sort of great detail, which is probably why I don't have a memory of it.
But I think you said a moment ago in your evidence that certainly no concerns were expressed by Mr Harrower
No.
when you advised him of the arrangements for the autopsy
No.
around the timetabling.
I do recall there was some discussion with Keith about timetabling. That may have been right at the very, very beginning, where I was saying to him that I wanted this post-mortem as quickly as possible, and we needed to know why this man had died while in the custody of the police officers. But I don't recall any further detail than that.
I seem to recall, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, that he may have given evidence that there had been a discussion around the possibility of the autopsy taking place on the 3rd. And he had said, no, from our perspective, that's not possible.
It's possible that took place. If Keith says it, I have no reason to doubt it at all. And it may well be the case that I said to him in the earliest conversation that I need to find out about mortuary space and availability of pathologists, but it might be that we could do it today, and if we can, that is a possibility, and that might be an idea. Again, this was about finding out why he had died, excluding natural causes, trying to find out, what had brought about his death. As I've indicated earlier, it seemed to me imperative that we do this as quickly as possible. And historically, we did do such postmortems at weekends, and indeed sometimes late at night. Had Dr. Shearer volunteered that or offered that, I would certainly not have discounted it.
Did Dr. Shearer express any concern around the timescale for the autopsy?
Not at all.
Can I read to you, please, a passage from her evidence? I don't know whether you followed any of the evidence in the inquiry.
No, I haven't. Since I retired, I've been abroad most of the time.
All right. This won't come up on the screen because it's from the transcript of the evidence, but I'll read it out to you. This is what she said. I remember it was a very dynamic situation, and there was insistence for the post-mortem to be done as quickly as possible. She was asked, I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about that for the chair. And she said, I remember at the time, because I took the phone call on the Sunday, and already there was a lot of media interest, there was a lot of information kind of already out there, and there was obviously questions because there had been police involvement as well. So I do remember there being a reasonable amount of stress surrounding that, and also a reasonable amount of pressure to get the post-mortem done as quickly as possible. But bearing in mind these sorts of post-mortems, I would have done as quickly as possible anyway. But I do remember, because of the circumstances surrounding the case, there was pressure that I've never felt before. Can you offer any comment on that?
Well, I don't know what sort of pressure she's talking about. I wasn't aware of any media or anything of that nature. Quite frankly, I was too busy doing my job to be paying any attention whatever to what the media might be saying or otherwise. And I can say without a shadow of doubt, I had no time looked at the media or was aware of the media during the whole course of that day. She may have felt pressure because she was seeing things on the media and was thinking, goodness gracious me, I'm being asked to do this post-mortem in what is obviously a high-profile case. I can't comment on that. She certainly didn't get any pressure from me. It was a perfectly ordinary, reasonable conversation with someone I've known for many years. I gave her such information as I had at the time about what had taken place. I certainly, obviously, told her that Mr. Bayoh was black, which is why there was the Quasar conversation. And I expressed the view that this was likely to become very high profile, and that was another reason why I wanted this done as quickly as possible. But I certainly applied no pressure whatever to Dr. Shearer.
Thank you. I want to move on to ask some questions now around identification of the body, and I wonder if we can turn to page 6 of your statement, paragraph 4. Late that night, about 23:30, I think, I was advised by Perk that the family had indicated they would not attend the mortuary to identify Mr. Bayoh. I instructed that the post-mortem should proceed as arranged. My reasons for this were that, in my view, it was essential to ascertain the cause of Mr. Bayoh's death as soon as possible. There were many possible causes. I thought the most likely would be postural asphyxia with a cardiopulmonary arrest, but there were other possibilities, such as a drug-related cause or a natural cause due to a medical condition. I had been made aware at some point that Mr. Bayoh had consumed drugs and that there were no bleeding injuries found at the hospital. In my opinion, it was necessary, in the public interest, for the post-mortem to proceed to inform the nature and direction of the investigation. All arrangements were in place, and his identity could be confirmed at a later stage. The body could be identified by Perk staff. So, who was it you spoke with that evening? Would it have been Mr. Harrower? Is this perhaps what you referred to at the very outset of your evidence?
Yes.
That it wasn't Pat Campbell you had the conversation with, it may have been Keith Harrower?
Indeed, it was definitely Keith Harrower.
So you spoke with Keith Harrower, and you were advised that the family had indicated they would not attend. Who did you understand the family to be?
I assumed that Mr. Harrower and his colleagues would be in contact with the nearest relatives. I assumed the family were the nearest relatives. I had no reason to question that, to be frank. At the time, I had no awareness of who the family might be or how many of them there might be, who they comprised, who the next of kin was. I had no knowledge of that at all.
And you say, I was advised by Perk that the family had indicated they would not attend the mortuary to identify Mr. Bayoh. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Okay. What I would like to do is just hold that thought, but perhaps move on to your second statement to compare what's said there. If we can look at your second statement, please. And it's in the numbered paragraphs, which are towards the back of the statement. And I'm looking for paragraph 42, please. This is quite a long paragraph. It might be easier if you can find paragraph 43, please, because it's towards the end. Yes, if we could scroll just a little bit further up. In fact, the top of that page would be perfect. Thank you very much. So here, are you with me, Mr. Green?
Yes.
At the top of the page that's got paragraph 43 towards the bottom, second paragraph from the top, you say, I ensured the family were advised of the time and place of the autopsy and that they were asked if they would attend and identify him. There was no obligation on them to do so. I was advised that the family were not willing to attend the mortuary and that they were waiting for elders to travel from, I believe, London. Moreover, I was advised that the family would consider this request once they arrived. Thus, there was no time frame for this to occur, nor any certainty that the family would ever attend to identify the body. In the face of this uncertainty and the necessity, in my view, of conducting the autopsy as soon as possible, I decided it should go ahead as arranged. So I want to be absolutely clear with you, Mr. Green, your understanding of the family's position, because in your first statement, you say, I was advised by the Perk that the family had indicated that they would not attend the mortuary to identify Mr. Bayoh. But here, you refer to the family not being willing to attend waiting for elders to travel from London, and that they would consider the request once they arrived. So they seem to be slightly different things to me. It's a matter for the chair at the end of the day, but I wonder if you could confirm what your understanding was on the 3rd, whether it was that the family were not willing to identify, or whether they were waiting for elders to travel from England and that they would consider the request when they arrived.
Well, my understanding at the time was they were not willing to attend at that point and identify, that they were waiting for elders. And I remember the word being used, and it struck me as an unusual word. I didn't quite understand what it meant, but that was of no moment. They were certainly waiting for others to come to Kirkcaldy, and that there would be a discussion, presumably with those individuals who had arrived and those who were already present in Kirkcaldy, about whether or not they would attend to identify Mr. Bayoh's body. Thus, there was this total uncertainty, and as I've indicated earlier, family do not have to go and identify. It's a request of them. It's not something that they can be compelled to do, and not infrequently families say, I don't want to go, I'm not prepared to go, no one in the family is going. So there was, for me, this difficulty that it was obvious when I had the conversation with Keith Harrower, he was advising me of the situation and waiting for me to make a decision. He didn't offer any views as to what the best course of action might be. Not that I would have expected him to. I knew it was my decision to take, and it seemed to me that in light of that uncertainty about when people would arrive, when discussions might take place, when discussions might conclude, it was totally unknown as to whether that would go way into the course of the week, that days might elapse. I had to take a decision. Had I decided to delay, potentially I would have been criticised by others for so doing. You know, there was the potential to be criticised by the forensic pathologists, by colleagues in Crown Office, etc. And I came to the conclusion that the proper thing to do in the interest of justice was to carry on with the post-mortem as discussed, organised and agreed.
So you explained that there was no time frame, and that left you with an uncertainty as to when the family were going to arrive, and indeed whether they would, even following their arrival, wish to attend for the purposes of identification. Did you ask Mr. Harrower when the elders were going to be arriving from London?
My recollection is that he didn't know. I don't recall that part of the conversation specifically, but I do recall thinking, oh my gosh, I've no idea when this is going to occur. And that, I felt, was a problem because, as I indicated earlier, knowledge and understanding of what had brought about Mr. Bayoh's death was the foundation upon which PERC would build their investigation. Without that, it was hard to see what they were investigating or how they were setting about it.
Did you ask him to make inquiries with the family to see if any more information could be obtained about the travel arrangements and the time frame?
Given the time of night, I did not, but what I did do was ask that the family be revisited the following day in the hope that they could be persuaded to go and identify. Not that that particularly mattered. I should also say that, you know, the family could have gone to see Mr. Bayoh at any point in time, so it wasn't necessary for them to see him before the post-mortem, and that's a cut-off, and they never get to see him again. It's always possible for families to go to the mortuary and to visit a loved one while they're still within the mortuary, and indeed, once remains are released to nearest relatives, to do so in a funeral parlour or in other circumstances. So, yeah, it was a difficult decision. Given the time of night, I didn't feel that there was anyone that I could really contact to discuss it with. So I thought it through, I have to say, quite quickly, and came to the view that that was the right decision to take, and that was the instruction I gave.
You said that at this point in time you didn't know much about the family, you didn't know who they were or how many family members there were, or who was the next of kin. Can I take it then you were not aware that Mr. Bayoh had a partner with whom he had a baby?
I had no knowledge of that.
Okay. And I think it must follow then that you wouldn't have had any information about her views in relation to identifying his body.
I'm just thinking about this. I should clarify. I think I was told on the Sunday that there was a partner with a baby, but I was certainly never told what his partner's views were about identification or anything else. I simply was aware that there was a partner and a child.
Okay. And we'll maybe look at her evidence later this morning, but if you had been told on the evening of the 3rd that Mr. Bayoh had a partner and that she was willing and able to identify the body, what would you have done?
I would have instructed Mr. Harrower not to go and see her at that time, given the lateness of the hour, but certainly to go and see her in the early hours of the following day in the hope that she would agree to attend at the mortuary, identify Mr. Bayoh, and matters could proceed as arranged. I had no knowledge who it was that Mr. Harrower had met with at all.
Ms. Thompson, would it be convenient to take the break now?
I think it would, Mayor.
Yeah,
So
20-minute
thank
break.
you.
Ms Thompson.
Mr. Green, shortly before the break, when we were talking about the arrangements for the identification of the body, you said, and I'm quoting here now from a printed copy of the morning's transcript, the family could have gone to see Mr. Bayoh at any point in time, so it wasn't necessary for them to see him before the post-mortem, and that is a cut-off and they never get to see him again. It's always possible for families to go to the mortuary and to visit a loved one while they are still within the mortuary, and indeed once remains are released to nearest relatives to do so in a funeral parlour or in other circumstances. So you were drawing to the inquiry's attention the potential for the family to see Mr. Bayoh's body at a later point in time, not necessarily prior to the autopsy, but at some point after the autopsy. And you're explaining that was always a possibility.
Yes, indeed, and it happens frequently. The mortuaries are quite well geared up to that kind of thing, and the APTs, the pathology technicians, are exceptionally skilled in making bodies presentable for viewing.
And we've heard evidence already that there is a viewing suite at the Edinburgh mortuary.
Yes.
With a glass screen with curtains where the body can be prepared and family members can view from the other side of that glass screen.
That would be usual prior to a post-mortem where the death was suspicious. The reason for having families and others view from behind the glass partition is to prevent them perhaps rushing forward and interacting with the body and potentially cross-contaminating in some way. After the post-mortem is concluded, all those samples have been taken, so there is nothing to prevent the family touching, holding, whatever they wish by way of interaction with the deceased.
You will appreciate through your experience as a fiscal that an autopsy is an invasive procedure.
Yes, I've been present at very many.
And do you understand that it's a procedure that is deeply resented by people of the Muslim faith?
Indeed.
And would you understand that even those who are not of the Muslim faith might find the prospect of viewing a body after that invasive procedure has been performed upon it to be traumatic, difficult, that they might have a preference to view the body before the procedure is carried out?
My experience shows that those who are grieving can adopt all sorts of different positions, and some want nothing to do with it, some complain that they're not allowed to touch before, some complain that they are asked to view. I well understand that may well be the situation, but in my experience, no nearest relatives, or very few nearest relatives, ever wish to have their loved ones subject to a post-mortem. I have been complained about for refusing a post-mortem, but that was a rather unusual situation. The vast majority of times people do not want this to occur, no matter what their faith or religion is.
You said in your evidence just a few moments ago that the reason for the glass screen is to prevent, prior to the autopsy taking place, the deceased's loved ones from potentially rushing forward and interfering in some way that could be problematic from an evidential perspective.
Indeed.
And that it's your understanding that once the autopsy has been performed, that concern falls away and there's not a need for a family to view from behind a glass screen. Is that
That's correct.
Your evidence? Now, the inquiry has heard evidence that some members of Sheikh Bayoh's family attended the mortuary a few days later, I think on the 6th from memory, for the purposes of not a formal identification but to view the body. And they were invited to do so from behind the glass screen. The curtains were opened and they viewed the body from behind the glass screen. They were not presented with the option of being able to approach his body in the same room, to touch his body, kiss his body. Does that surprise you?
I have no real knowledge of how the Edinburgh mortuary organises those family visits. I would say from a Fiscal's perspective, there's nothing whatever to prevent them from interacting by touching, kissing, or whatever the body. I simply don't know what arrangements they have in place at Edinburgh, because to all intents and purposes, as Procurator Fiscal, once I've had the postmortem, once the postmortem has concluded, then my intent is to release that body as quickly as I possibly can back to the family, and I'm not actually concerned what's happening with it. So I can't say I've ever made inquiry as to how they organise these things in the lawn market, but there is certainly no reason why they can't interact with the body. There's any evidence that might be recovered has been recovered, and there's the body will have been washed and prepared by the EPTs. So I'm sorry, I can't really comment beyond that.
But from your perspective as a Fiscal, there would be no reason why a family should not be able to approach their loved one, touch and kiss the body after the autopsy has taken place and all evidence has been gathered and samples have been taken.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Returning to the evidence that you gave shortly before the break, I had asked you to confirm your understanding of the family's position as at the evening of the 3rd. And I asked you to do that because there was a subtle but potentially important difference between your first statement and your second statement on that point. And again, quoting from the transcript, you said, "My understanding at the time was that they were not willing to attend at that point and identify, that they were waiting for elders," and you said something about the use of that word, "to come to Kirkcaldy, and that there would be a discussion, presumably with those individuals who'd arrived and those who were already present in Kirkcaldy, about whether or not they would attend to identify Mr. Bayoh's body. Thus there was this total uncertainty." So that was your evidence before the break, that the family were not willing to attend at that point in time for the purposes of identification, that they were waiting for elders to arrive, and when they arrived there would be a discussion around whether or not they would attend to view the body. And there was an uncertainty, as far as you were concerned, as to the timescale for these people arriving and this decision being made.
Yes, I've amplified my first statement in the second statement, and the second statement is the position.
Thank you for confirming that. What I would like to do now, and I appreciate you've told us that since your retirement you have not been following public inquiries, which of course are live streamed. I would like to share with you some of the evidence that the inquiry has heard that bears on this issue, really just for the purposes of putting it to you for your comment, and I may have some questions around it. And I'd like to begin with the evidence that we heard from Caddy Johnston. That's Mr. Bayoh's sister, and she described being visited by a person who she thought was a Flo, but it was in fact Keith Harrower, on the evening of the 3rd of May. So I'm going to quote from the transcript. Again, I'm afraid this doesn't come up on the screen, but I'll read it out. If you want me to repeat anything, just say. He said, "Are you ready to come down to the hospital to identify the body?" That's how he said it. "And what was your reply?" I said, "No." I said, "His mother is in London and I'm arranging for her to come up tomorrow." That was the Monday. I said, "Once she is here, she would want to see her son as well, and we will go and identify the body." Did you make it clear to that person that you would go the next day once Sheku's mother was in Kirkcaldy? I told them that our mum was coming on the next day and we can arrange to see the body then. Yes. And when you explained to the person you think is from Perk, the family liaison officer, that Sheku's mum would be travelling up the next day, did you make it clear that you would be willing to identify the body once she arrived in Scotland? Yes. It was clear that we will identify the body once my mum is here. That was made clear. So you were willing to identify the body? Yes, we were willing to identify the body. The only thing we asked for is to wait for my mum. That's all we asked for. Right. Did you make that clear to the Perk? Yes. So when this conversation was concluded, what was your understanding of the position about identifying the body? I thought they accepted our request and they will wait for my mum to come, then we can arrange to go and see the body. So I appreciate you haven't heard that before, but that is the evidence that Caddy Johnson gave to this inquiry. Now, it's a matter for the chair, but if the chair accepts her evidence as to what she said to Mr. Harrower, then it would suggest that Mr. Harrower understood that the family were willing to attend,
Yes,
to,
clearly.
to identify the body, and indeed that Sheku's mother wanted to see his body,
Indeed.
and that they wanted to wait for his mother to travel from London, and that she would be arriving the next day. That was all in Caddy's evidence.
Oh, yes,
wasn't it?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
So it's entirely a matter for the chair, but if he were to accept her evidence that she said these things to Mr. Harrower, then it would follow that there was really no uncertainty or ambiguity as to their position. Their position was quite clear. Would you agree with that?
Well, it certainly was not made clear to me.
And that's another matter, and we will come to that. But if we can stay with Caddy Johnson's evidence for now.
Oh, yes, I totally accept what you say. And frankly, had that information been conveyed to me, while I wouldn't have done anything at 12:30 or 11:30 at night, I would certainly have used my phone from the car the following day to try to organise a post-mortem for the Tuesday and put it back, given that there's a clear indication that Sheku's mother is going to attend and that they're willing to attend the mortuary, but that was not made known to me at all.
All right. So you accept on the basis of the evidence of Caddy Johnson, which I've shared with you today, that it gave a clear indication that Sheku's mother was willing to attend to identify the body and she'd be arriving the following day.
Yes.
Okay. So there was no ambiguity as to her position and no uncertainty around the time frame. Would that be fair?
Well, it's not a matter for me to assess whether what she says is accurate on the basis of what you're putting to me. Indeed, that is the case, and as I've indicated, had that been made clear to me, had I been made aware of any of that, I would have sought to put this back for a day to allow his mother to attend the mortuary.
And your very clear position in your evidence is that this was not made known.
Absolutely
to you.
not.
Okay.
I don't actually recall mention of his mother at all. What stuck in my mind was the use of the word elders. I didn't. We're talking a conversation at 11:30 at night. I'm due to be up and on my way to Abernight in Perth by 6 the following morning. I'm not digging into it. I'm accepting the information that I'm given at face value because I expect it to be accurate.
Thank you. So that was Caddy Johnson's evidence, and I simply wanted to put it to you. I appreciate you haven't heard it before today. I wanted to put it to you for your comment. And I wonder if we can now look at Mr. Harrower's evidence, and if we can look perhaps at his inquiry statement, which is SBPI 00259, at paragraph 55. After explaining to the family regarding the PERC role and function, I then advised the family that COPFS had made arrangements for a post-mortem examination on the afternoon of Monday, 4th of May. So sorry, I should have said this is a conversation he's having with the family on the 3rd
Yes,
of
I
May.
understand.
I asked for 2 family members to make themselves available to attend the City Mortuary in Edinburgh to identify the body. My operational notes at page 9 state that Addy stated the family had discussed matters and no representatives were willing to do the identification until family members, including the now deceased's mother, attended. She was travelling with a group including elders from England. My understanding of this was that the family were refusing to do the identification in the timescale outlined. I don't think it was the intention that it would be the mother who would do the identification, but that they were not willing to participate in that process until she arrived. I'm aware she was travelling from down south or was about to travel. I don't have any recollection of being advised as to when she would arrive. I got the impression she was in the process of travelling, but don't think established where she was actually coming from, other than it was somewhere in England. I think it was suggested that they would arrive at some time the following day, which was the Monday, and obviously the post-mortem was arranged for midday on the Monday. I have been asked if the family understood that it was the Crown's decision as to the timing of the post-mortem. Yes, I think so. had explained specifically it was the Crown's decision. My statement records that Mr Johnson wasn't willing to be more specific on the expected arrangements of the arrival of the family members. That part of the conversation was closed down. So again, it's entirely a matter for the chair at the end of the day, but can I suggest we see here that this is entirely consistent with what Carrie Johnson said in her evidence, that there wasn't a refusal to identify, there was a willingness to identify, but a request that the post-mortem procedure be delayed to allow that, to allow the mother and elders to travel from England. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
I wonder if we can, if I can take you now to what Mr Harrower said in his evidence. Again, I'm reading from a transcript, so I'm sorry this won't come up on the screen, but he was asked about the conversation on the 3rd, the conversation that he had with you on the 3rd, late in the evening. And your position as set out in your first statement, which I appreciate you finessed in your second statement, the position you set out in your first statement was put to him for comment. In response to which he said, "I'm fairly confident that I told him that that is you, regarding the expected visitors travelling, and that there would be no decision finally made on that until they had arrived." So basically accurately summarising the discussion with Mr Johnson in relation to the arrangement for the post-mortem. But I understand from what you said before I took you to these transcripts that your position is that it was not made clear to you that the mother would be travelling the following day and that she wished to identify the body.
I was given no time frame for her attending, and in particular I was never told that she would wish to view the body. My recollection is clear that they were unwilling to attend at that time, that they were waiting for the arrival of others, that there would then be some discussion, and there was no indication given to me that the family wished to go to to see Mr Bayoh, nor that they would be willing to do so or to carry out an identification. And as I said earlier, they don't have to do that. It's a request of them. They could refuse. So that left me in a position where it was completely uncertain, so far as I was concerned, as to when this post-mortem might take place if I delayed it.
And you explained before the break that in those circumstances you came to the decision that the proper course was to proceed with the autopsy on the 4th as planned.
Well, indeed, and one of the things I do remember thinking at the time was, having dealt with lots of Muslim deaths in the past, while I knew that they didn't wish post-mortems, they were accepting of them when we said that we required to do them. But the one thing they always emphasised was that they wanted it done as quickly as possible, and they wanted the remains back with the family as quickly as possible. So I took account of that as well, and frankly I thought I was doing the right thing on the basis of the information I was made aware of.
Let's stay with that thought for a moment, please. When you said they, I think you're perhaps referring to people from the Muslim faith.
Yes.
Like to have an autopsy. If it has to be done, it should be done as soon as possible, because
Indeed.
burial should take place as soon as possible. I
Well,
think.
absolutely, and that hence the need to return the body to the family as quickly as practicable. I used to liaise very frequently with the Central Mosque in Glasgow, because it was directly across from Ballater Street, the Fiscal's office there, which was where I was based. And I had many discussions with individuals in the mosque, and very much understood that time was of the essence, and they wanted things to be progressed as quickly as we possibly could, assuming we required to do a post-mortem. And indeed, I can say that myself and my staff very frequently were in touch with the mortuaries and the pathologists to say, can you expedite this because of the religious requirements? So it was very firmly in my mind at that time.
And I wonder if we can look briefly at your second statement towards the very end, paragraph 77, where you emphasise much the same point as you've made now in your evidence.
Yes.
You say that you understood Mr. Bayoh was Muslim, And though I don't recall from whom I received that information or when, I certainly considered it as a possibility, hence my concern to ensure as far as possible that the post-mortem process proceeded as expeditiously as possible in order that his remains be released to his family at the earliest point.
Yes.
So you've explained that you made the assumption that that is what the family would desire on the basis of their faith, and that's based on your own understanding of Muslim burial requirements and your own experience, and in particular your experience in Glasgow of working with the local mosque.
Indeed.
Okay. And I think you said, I don't have the transcript of your evidence in front of me, but you said a moment ago that that decision or that assumption was well intended or well meaning or words to that effect.
Absolutely. My thought and indeed my hope was that if we could conclude the post-mortem on the Monday, Mr. Bayoh's remains would be released to the family potentially on the Tuesday, possibly the Wednesday, but within that sort of time frame. That's what I was really trying to achieve.
I'd like to share some further information with you from the evidence. And again, this comes from Keith Harrower. He was asked, would there have been any reason why you couldn't have asked David Green to delay the post-mortem? And he said, to be honest, it's not for me to interfere in that process. I am unaware of what the availability of the appropriate people are, including the pathologist, what was available, whether that day or further ahead in the timescale. It's not for me. He was aware of all of the circumstances that were relevant in relation to the scheduling of that. Can you explain why you didn't choose to give your opinion to David Green about perhaps delaying or deferring the post-mortem until the mother had arrived? As I say, I didn't know what the alternatives were. Again, that wouldn't be something that I would ask him. He's a very senior member of the Crown Office, and I didn't feel it was my position to push for any sort of alternative. He was armed with all the relevant information on the feelings of the family in relation to that, and he has clearly had uppermost in his mind as regards finding out medically what caused the death, which was very important for the investigation moving forward. So I chose not to pursue anything else in relation to those arrangements. He knew what the facts were. Looking back, given the evidence that you've given this morning, would you agree with Mr. Harrower's statement that you knew what the facts were?
Well, plainly not. I had no idea that the family had been expressing the wishes that you put to me earlier. I had no idea whatever that his mother wished to see him and that they were willing to attend to identify. That was not the position as I understood it. It's not what was said to me. So, and as I've indicated, had I been made aware of that, I would have sought to put back the post-mortem.
And do you have any comment to make on Mr. Harrower's feeling that it wasn't for him to urge you to push the post-mortem back, it wasn't for him to ask for a delay to that procedure?
I have to say that I'm slightly surprised. I had quite a lot of interactions with Mr. Harrower, even when he was a police officer. I would say I knew him reasonably well and had certainly quite a lot of contact with him when he was in Perk. He's quite a forceful character. He isn't backward about expressing his views, and I don't doubt that he would have felt perfectly able to express his views to me, but he certainly did no such thing. I would have welcomed his views, to be frank. He has had interaction with the family. I'm remote from the family. I'm remote from what's going on. So it would have been helpful to me to have that input, but he offered no input at all.
Can we return to your first statement, please, and look at page 6, the bottom of page 6. Very bottom of page 6, you say, I understood that Perk would approach the family again the following morning to see if they'd changed their mind and would identify. And you've told us about that expectation already, that contact would be made with the family in the morning. And if we can look at the top paragraph on page 7 now, please. You'll see there are some redactions here, at least on the version on the screen. but you left about 6 a.m. on the 4th to travel somewhere, and you returned home perhaps about 1900 hours. During that time, I had no contact or calls in relation to Mr. Bayoh's death, and it follows that I issued no instructions. So you had understood that the PERC would approach the family again the following morning to see if there had been any change to their position. Had you expected to be updated as to the outcome of that discussion?
My recollection of this is that I asked that they go back and ask the family to see if they would change their minds and would identify. That, I think, is supportive of what I've said about the information that I understood at the time. Had there been this willingness to identify, and had that been made known to me, there would be no point in me sending PERC back to ask the family again. But I specifically recall saying, look, it's late at night, go back and see them tomorrow morning, see if they're willing to identify, explain that the postmortem is going to have to go ahead at that time, and asking them or giving them a second opportunity to do that. Now, as I say, I think that indicates that the information that I was given is supportive of the fact that nobody told me they were willing to attend. That was not the information that I was given. So, yes, I definitely recall giving Keith Harrower an instruction to that effect. And as for whether I expected him to contact me or someone to contact me to tell me what had transpired, yes, but at the same time, senior colleagues had then become involved. Stephen McGowan was involved. John Logue, again a senior colleague, had become involved. They were both aware that I had been deployed to Perthshire to a DVI body recovery. So I expected that they would be getting involved, and potentially information would have been given to them. What I can certainly say is that while I was exceptionally busy on that Monday, I did not receive any calls at all about this matter.
And we see that set out at the end of that top paragraph on the page. During that time, I had no contact or calls in relation to Mr. Bayoh's death, and it follows I issued no instructions.
Not that I recall, and I certainly issued no further instructions. My view was that in light of the circumstances, as I understood them, the matter should go ahead at 12 noon.
Again, can I share with you some of the evidence that we've heard already? And again, I'm afraid I'm reading from a transcript here, but this is the evidence of Billy Little. So on the 3rd, Mr. Harrower was the duty SIO, and on the 4th, Mr. Little was appointed as the SIO. Now, in his evidence, he was asked about a section in his statement which states that he was further advised during the events on the 3rd of May. The immediate family had intimated to Mr. Harrower that they did not wish the post-mortem process to proceed and asked that it be deferred for relatives and elders to attend from England. The family could not give a date or time of arrival for such persons. This had been passed to Crown Office, but instructions had been given that the post-mortem would be taking place. The family intimated they would not be engaging in this process. I've been asked whether I ever dealt with a request from a family regarding the timing of a post-mortem for religious or other reasons. My recollection is that no, I haven't. I've been asked what I did with this request. I did have a discussion with the Crown, David Green, about it in this instance. Keith had had some interaction with the family the night before. Although I was appointing 2 family liaison officers to deal with the family, but Keith had met the family, so I asked him to phone again and asked them again to engage with us in the post-mortem process. So although Keith had told me they didn't want to be involved in the process, I asked Keith to contact the family because they knew who he was. Well, if those had been appointed, they'd never met the families. What I got back from Keith was, no, they're not engaging, they don't want the post-mortem to go ahead. I phoned Dave Green at Crown Office about that, and David told me that the post-mortem was going ahead. I haven't recorded it anywhere, but my recollection is his words were, we need to know how this man died. So I can only ask the Crown, I can only impart to the Crown the information. It's the Crown's decision to hold a post-mortem, and when that post-mortem takes place and who undertakes the post-mortem, it's not my decision. Dave Green wasn't willing to delay the post-mortem. So again, can I invite your comment on that? Because Mr. Little has given evidence that he was told by Keith Harrower to make further contact, he told Keith Harrower to make further contact with the family, which he did. The response was fed back to him and he contacted you about it on the 4th. But you've told us that you had no recollection of having received any calls. Does this jog your memory at all?
I'm afraid it doesn't. I'm not disputing that it may have happened, but as I've indicated, I was involved in travelling to and dealing with another incident. There were many calls about all sorts of things. I certainly do not recall that conversation, but if it happened, it wasn't something that was going to cause me to change my instruction, because there was still no suggestion of a time or a certainty that they would attempt to identify. So without the benefit of my notes, I can't even say that I made a note about this because I have no recollection of it at all. I can't give you another answer than that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. We have heard over the last couple of days from Kate Frame, who I think was a former Crown Office colleague of yours, but
Yes.
in May of 2015 was the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner. And she gave the following evidence. She was asked, sticking with the issue of independence, we've heard some evidence that connects to the post-mortem that was carried out on Mr. Bayoh. I appreciate this happened on the 4th of May. You said you were in the office for a brief period during that day. I think in your inquiry statement you do say that you'd spoken to Dave Green from the Crown Office. Yes, Mr. Green, yes. And you were aware of the family's wishes, that they wished his mother to come up from London prior to identifying the body at a post-mortem. Yes, my recollection is that it was family members. I don't just recall it being tied to the mother coming. Was the mother to be part of a group of others as well? Yes. I understood that to be the case. How did you become aware of the family's wishes? I think that information was shared with me by Mr. Little. When was that, do you remember? That would be on the morning of the 4th. And then there was a discussion about where and when the call took place. Tell us about your discussion with Mr. Green at Crown Office. Well, I was aware from Mr. Little that Crown Office, and I didn't know precisely who, had been made aware of this issue, and I wanted to ensure that he, as head of the deaths unit, of the circumstances, so that that could be considered. What did you tell Mr. Green? My recollection is that I told him that the family had indicated they wanted other family members present before the post-mortem went ahead. What was his response? I think he was trying to balance the need for, to see if a cause of death could be ascertained against that. But the eventual outcome was that the post-mortem had been arranged by that time and was to continue. What efforts did you make to persuade him to delay the post-mortem? I tried. I did explain to him that the family's wishes were for it to be delayed until the other family members had arrived. Unfortunately, there was no indication of when that would happen, so I suppose his view was how long was the post-mortem to be delayed for, and we didn't have that information. So do you recall now having had a conversation with Kate Frame on the morning of the 4th? Does this assist you at all? No.
No, I'm afraid it doesn't. I have no recollection of it. I have no reason to doubt that the conversation took place. What I would say is that, again, on the information that you've given me, I'm not being given any additional information about when this, when the family might be available, when the post-mortem might take place. I think it's entirely conceivable that I did say to Kate, no, there's no certainty here. It's going ahead as arranged, because how long is this wait going to be? How long is a piece of string in effect? I was, as I've indicated earlier, exceptionally conscious of the need to find out why Mr. Bayoh had died.
Now, this was, of course, an Article 2 investigation by the state bodies concerned, and so the next of kin required to be involved in the procedure to the extent necessary to safeguard their legitimate interests. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And I'm wondering, in a case of this sort, where there are competing interests, and I understand that your position is that you had no indication of timescale and indeed no clear indication that the family would attend to identify the body at all. But there was perhaps some suggestion that they were waiting for elders or family members to travel from London before taking a decision. How did you go about balancing that information against the competing interest of the desirability of having a swift post-mortem to ascertain the cause of death following a death in police custody? How do you weigh up these interests?
I think it's exceptionally difficult to do so, and these were exceptionally difficult circumstances. It is an Article 2 investigation. One of the things that needs to happen as well is that it should be conducted as quickly as possible. It's an enormous, it's very, very, very difficult. It seemed to me that the quicker we knew why it was that Mr. Bayoh had died, the better it would be for the nearest relatives, because they would have some clarity and certainty. It might have been that he had died of natural causes, and there were lots of possibilities as to how that might have come about. There was plainly a need that PERC were aware of how he had died. We were aware of how he had died, and the investigation could progress. It's an almost impossible balance. What I would say again is this: had I been told that they were willing to identify, had I been told that they were en route or that this was likely to be a short delay, I would have taken a different decision. But that's not the information that I was given, and it's not the basis upon which I proceeded.
Of course, I understand that that's your evidence. So should we understand then that if you had been provided with that information and you'd weighed that in the scales against the desirability of a quick autopsy, the scales would have tipped in the other direction, and you would have been willing to delay the autopsy until the Tuesday to allow for the family to attend and identify?
What I would say is this, that had that been the case, I would have been in contact with Dr. Shearer to check out the availability of mortuary spaces and pathology to ensure that it was going to be the Tuesday and not pushed back a significant period of time. Had I been given information that it would be pushed back further, I might well have insisted it go ahead at that time. So I would have sought more information. I did not seek that information because that was not my understanding.
On the assumption that the autopsy could have been rescheduled for the Tuesday, possibly even the Wednesday,
I would have been happy to do that.
Thank you. I took you to Dr. Shearer's evidence earlier this morning, the evidence that she felt that the time frame put her under a degree of pressure. And we've heard some evidence that the PERC were also feeling the pressure in terms of the time scale. We've heard evidence from the PERC that by the time they had deployed and made their way to Kirkcaldy Police Office, it was about 1:30 in the afternoon. There were only 6 of them. There wasn't a flow on duty over the weekend. A flow and Alistair Lewis was appointed at a briefing at 9 o'clock on the Monday morning. And by lunchtime on the Monday, still had not been able to make direct contact with the family. So those were the circumstances. That was what was happening behind the scenes at PERC, and I appreciate you wouldn't have had that information.
No, I wasn't aware of any of that.
But I would like to share with you what Mr. Little had to say in relation to the post-mortem. He said, if the post-mortem had been delayed, then I could have had my family liaison officers meet with the family, engage with the family, try to explain to them in a controlled and calm environment about what's going to happen. But the post-mortem just went ahead. And he was asked, would your preference have been for the post-mortem to be delayed? He said, I understand the rationale as we needed to identify as soon as possible the cause of death. I understand the rationale for that, but to balance that against the family's wishes and the reasoning they gave, sitting here now, the post-mortem should have been on the Tuesday. Would it have hindered your investigation in any way if the post-mortem had taken place the next day? And he said, no. Could I invite any comment that you might wish to make on that evidence? I appreciate your understanding of the facts on the 3rd and the 4th was different from his, but would you wish to comment on that at all?
No, I don't see what comments I can usefully make.
Let me share with you then some evidence given by Alistair Lewis. He was the flow. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, the inquiries heard evidence that there were no flows on call over the weekend. He came on duty at 8 o'clock in the morning of the Monday morning, and was appointed as the flow at a briefing at 9 o'clock. I think we heard evidence too that Mr. Harrower's return call to the family was about 10:30 in the morning, and of course the autopsy was scheduled to take place at midday. And in between time, for one reason or another, it hadn't come to pass that there had been an opportunity for Mr. Harrower, Mr. Little, to introduce the flow to the family, for reasons that needn't concern us this morning. But what he did say, that the flow, Mr. Lewis, in his evidence was this: the time constraint created a challenge that didn't need to be there. He explained that he started at 8 o'clock in the morning, had to get information, then he had to go and speak to the family. He hadn't had that opportunity, and he was asked if he had had that opportunity to speak with the family, then perhaps the misunderstanding around their position on identification that was clearly within the PERC might have been uncovered, and some action might have been taken to allow the family to identify before the post-mortem took place. And he said yes, he was confident if he'd had that interaction and spoken to the family, then he would have been able to resolve that issue. And he was asked whether he was concerned on the morning of the 4th that this perfect storm of events and the timescale that he was working to and the difficulties he was having making contact with the family were creating a situation where he couldn't fulfil his responsibilities in terms of the PERC standard operating procedure on family liaison officers. And he said he felt the initiative had been lost, making contact with the family, interacting with the family, obtaining information. It's very important to speak with the family. And he was asked, did it occur to you to say to more senior management or indeed directly to the Fiscal, hang on here, it's 10:30, I'm not long on duty, I've just been briefed, I've just been appointed as the flow, I've not met the family yet, and if this post-mortem goes ahead at lunchtime, I will not have the opportunity to fulfil my responsibilities in terms of the policy, to speak to the family about the need for the post-mortem, to speak to the family about the need for identification. And did it cross your mind on the 4th of May to have that conversation? And he said, I wanted to have the conversation, but I didn't just want to go and say, I think we should be doing this. He wanted to have more information from the family first to present a better case. So I appreciate that you won't have heard any of this before, but what I would like to ask you is this: if you had a call from Alistair Lewis, the flow, at, say, 10:30 on the Monday morning, and if he had said to you, look, I've been appointed as flow less than 2 hours ago, I've not yet had the opportunity to meet the family, I haven't yet been able to establish contact with the family, I've got certain responsibilities in terms of our standard operating procedure, I need to introduce myself, I need to sit down with the family, I need to explain the need for an autopsy to take place, I need to explain the options around identification, and I just cannot achieve this by midday, what would you have done?
I'm slightly surprised it was so late in the day, given that the timing of the post-mortem was arranged long before that. But had he contacted me and expressed that view, I would certainly have taken some account of it, but no such view was expressed. As I say, my understanding was as set out in my second statement, and that gave me no reason to believe that the family wished to identify, that the family wished to go to the mortuary, and that it was simply a matter of delaying. As I've said earlier, had I been aware of that, I would have taken a different decision.
No,
and it follows that I would have taken a different decision had the flow approached me and explained these matters to me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the issue around identification is perhaps a slightly different issue, and your evidence on that is very clear to me. From the flow's perspective, he felt that having come on duty at 8 o'clock, having been appointed at 9, having then had a briefing, having then spoken with officers as he was duty-bound to do, who'd already had contact with the family and so on and so forth, having been updated by Mr. Harrower at 10:30, that the clock was ticking, 12 o'clock was not far away. And I'm simply wondering whether if he had made that call, leaving the identification issue to one side, And if he had said to you, listen, I'm just on duty, I've just been appointed, there are certain requirements that are imposed on me in terms of our family liaison, standard operating procedure or policy, and I'm being thwarted in fulfilling these responsibilities because the clock is ticking. I've not managed to make contact with the family in spite of my best efforts. I've not been able to sit down with them and introduce myself, explain the need for the autopsy, discuss identification with them. Can you push the autopsy back to give me the chance to do that? I'm wondering what you would have done.
I would certainly have taken account of it, but it didn't happen.
For the avoidance of doubt, Mr. Lewis didn't say that it did happen. He was quite clear that he hadn't made that call and he hadn't made that ask. So I appreciate that we're in a hypothetical territory here, but I'm simply keen to explore if that call had been made and that information had been brought to your door, that the PERC had been unable to fulfil their own obligations in terms of their own terms of reference, if you like, because of the timescale, whether you would have considered delaying the autopsy.
I certainly would have considered it. The Flows have a very, very, very difficult job to do, and relationships with families are sometimes exceptionally fraught, just because of the fact that you're dealing with a death which has come suddenly and brings with it all the issues you might anticipate. So had he asked me on that basis, I would certainly have considered it, and I probably, given what I'm being told now, would have gone back to Dr. Shearer to say, look, can we backslide this a little bit? But no such request was made. Now, so far as I was concerned, PERC were engaged with the family, albeit that engagement had seemingly had been unproductive from the perspective that of having someone to attend at the postmortem. I was unaware that PERC had not had flows out on the Sunday and didn't have that process in place. So far as I was concerned, those were operational matters for PERC. I expected that they would have deployed flows. I can't say anything other than that.
Okay. Can I tell you now a little about Colette Bell's evidence? Again, you won't have heard this before. She was, of course, Sheku Bayoh's partner, and she was given the death message on the morning of the 5th of May and asked to give a statement immediately after the death message was delivered to her. And in her evidence, she was asked about the giving of that statement, and she said the following. She said, I would have to give a statement, and I said, I don't want to give a statement, I want to see Shek. And they said, you know, they understood it was difficult, but it was really important to try and get the statement so they could get all the information that they needed to find out what had happened. I had said, no, I just want to see Shek, I just want to see Shek. And I remember saying over and over again, I don't want to do anything, I just want to see Shek. And they had said, if you get the statement done, then we'll see about you going to see him. And she was asked, well, what was your understanding of the position? And she said, well, I thought I'll do the statement and then I'll get to see him. They've said that he would need to be identified anyway, and they had said, you will get to see him, so if you get your statement done, you'll get to see him because he needs to be identified anyway. And you already told us that you had no knowledge really as to who Sheku Bayoh's family were over the course of the short period of time that you were involved in the initial investigation of his death. But if you had been told on the 3rd or even on the morning of the 4th that Colette Bell had expressed a very strong desire to see Shek and to identify his body, what steps might you have taken?
Well, as I said earlier, when you asked a similar question, had I been made aware that she was willing to attend and identify, I would have said that she should do that. And that remains the position, but none of this was known to me at all. I perhaps naively assumed that when Mr. Harrower said he was in contact with the family, that he was in contact with all of those who one would consider from a Fiscal's perspective to be nearest relatives. So this is all news to me and puts a totally different complexion on it, but I was never told that she was willing to identify, nor that she wished to go and see the body.
I appreciate this is all news to you, and these weren't matters that were necessarily within your knowledge at the time that you were involved in the investigation of this death. Looking back, might there have been a benefit in you asking more probing questions of Mr. Harrower, or did you consider that these were entirely operational matters for the PERC? By that I mean a liaison with the family, identifying who the family members were and making appropriate contact with them.
Well, when I was advised that he had spoken to the family, as I've indicated, I was of the clear view that he was referring to all of those nearest relatives. I didn't ask any probing questions because of the manner in which that was presented to me. Those are operational matters. I'm not on the ground, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to be there. So I'm relying on the information that is being passed to me and making judgments based on that. And as I've indicated now twice, all of these issues with Ms. Bell are totally news to me. The first time I've heard them is today.
Thank you. Let's move on to the post-mortem. So that took place on Monday the 4th, and you've explained in your statements, and we've touched on it in evidence already, that Bernard Ablett attended the post-mortem as the Fiscal. The PERC also had a presence at the post-mortem, including Billy Little. Did you anticipate the police attending the post-mortem?
I recall some discussion with Keith Harrower about the body being identified potentially by a police officer who took control of the body in the Victoria Infirmary, and then a member of PERC staff who took over control from the police officer. That post-mortem was under the control of PERC. It's a matter entirely for PERC as to who is there. It was just a quick discussion about where we might get some identification to ensure we're talking about the same person that had gone into the hospital, that had then gone to the city mortuary, etc. I wouldn't have anticipated police officers being present at all, other than potentially, as I say, a witness coming in to identify, but identification witnesses identify and are then sent away. They don't have any other purpose in the process in the mortuary. And I might have expected that some samples might require to be taken to the forensic lab and would be handed over to police officers potentially to transport them. But I can't see why police officers would have been present in the mortuary at all. It was a PERC investigation. They were in control of it. It had been handed over to them. I'm surprised if there were police officers present.
And for completeness, I think you say in your first statement at paragraph 69, I don't think there's a need to pull this up, it's in short compass, that you would be unsurprised if the police were present to assist with seizing productions and conveying samples to laboratories, but under the direction and control of the PERC.
Yeah, to explain that, I wouldn't anticipate they would be in the mortuary room, although I would anticipate that PERC investigators would be while the examination was carried out, and where their label samples that required to be transmitted, they would be taken out of there and handed over to police officers who would be in the building potentially, but not within the mortuary suite. Because they have no purpose in being there, it's a PERC investigation. And moreover, from my perspective, there was a potential we would end up with police officer accused here, but it was also possible we'd end up with Police Scotland as an accused here. So I certainly anticipated all of those intimately engaged and involved with the process in the mortuary would be PERC.
We've heard evidence that there were a number of police officers in attendance, including a DCI Hardy. Does that give you any cause for concern?
Well, as I've indicated, it's not their investigation. Mm-hmm. They were left to investigate what had occurred in the aftermath of this boxing match that I understood had been watched. PERC were instructed to investigate everything that occurred from the time the police were made aware of Mr. Bayoh's the allegations from members of the public that were called in to them, from that point right through until he was conveyed to the Victoria Infirmary. So there's, to my mind, absolutely no role for the police to be there. I don't recognise the name DCI Hardy, and I certainly, had I been asked about it, would have said that the police shouldn't be there, but I was certainly never asked. And I have to say, I'm surprised that they were there, very surprised.
The police, of course, had retained responsibility for investigating, as you put it, the boxing match and what had happened earlier in the evening up to the point of the 999 calls and the events at Hayfield Road. Does that change anything? Would you consider that their ongoing responsibility for that aspect of the investigation would have created a legitimate need to be in attendance at the autopsy?
No, because any samples that were obtained, say, for toxicology, would be obtained as part of the post-mortem process to ascertain what part, if any, they played in his death. That information, were it relevant to what had happened earlier on, could readily be conveyed to PERC and would be conveyed to PERC, would be made known to PERC, rather, after analysis. So I don't see any purpose in them being there. As I say, I'm very surprised.
We heard evidence from Mr. Little. Again, I'm reading from his transcript. He was asked whether he'd expressed surprise or challenged the presence of the police at the post-mortem, and he said, "I certainly never challenged it. I never asked Mr. Ablett why the police were there." And he also said, on reflection, sitting here now, all these years later, not only was it untidy, it threw doubt on the independence aspect of the investigation into the death. But would you agree with that?
I totally agree with that, and I would say about Billy Little, again, he's a former police officer whom I had worked on quite a number of cases with. In fact, he was a DI in Stewart Street in Glasgow when I was the Fiscal for Central and West Glasgow, so I had quite a number of murder cases and things involving him. I'm absolutely, frankly, astonished that he let them be there. I would have expected him to say, "You've no role here, please leave."
Kate Frame was asked about this in her evidence. Now, she didn't have any knowledge, or she gave evidence that she had no knowledge of the officers being present at the post-mortem. When she was asked if you'd known, would you have been concerned? And she said, yes, I would have thought it inappropriate for the officers to be present. And I see you're nodding your agreement. She went on to say, when asked what her PERC officers might have done, "I think they could have raised concerns. But my understanding is that post-mortems are convened at the hand of the Crown, and anyone present is there under the direction of Crown Office." Now, you said a few moments ago in your evidence it was for the PERC to decide who was there. So,
well, I expected PERC would staff the post-mortem suite for the purposes that we needed them. I had no expectation that police officers would be there at all, other than, as I say, for the limited purpose of identifying him and then departing, and potentially to be asked to convey samples to the lab at the end of the post-mortem. I'm concerned, and had I been asked about this or known about this, I would have said that they should leave. And I say that because that's to preserve the sanctity of the investigation. Potentially, as I indicated earlier, we might have had police officers who were going to become accused in this matter. We might have had, in fact, some form of case against Police Scotland. So I can only say I'm astonished, and I'm very surprised that it wasn't challenged.
So this is an autopsy that has been instructed on the authority of the instruction of the Crown. The PERC are investigating again on the direction of the Crown.
Mm-hmm.
We have the Commissioner give evidence that it was a matter for the Crown to decide who was present. But I understand that your evidence is that really it was a matter for the PERC to decide who should be present. And I'm just wondering how we might resolve this difference.
The post-mortem is a Crown-instructed post-mortem, but the investigation had been handed by me to PERC. I can't see how it would be thought to be a decision of the Fiscal who should be present at the post-mortem. As I say, my expectation was that it would be entirely manned by PERC and run by them, and I'm just astonished that police officers were present.
So although the post-mortem had been instructed by the Crown, do I understand your evidence correctly to be that because the investigation had been effectively handed over to the PERC, the post-mortem is a part of that investigation?
Absolutely.
And it was up to them to determine who should be present?
Or if they were concerned, to seek advice and guidance from COPFS. I can say without fear or favour, if someone had asked me, I would have said, tell them to leave.
Now, Mr. Ablett, of course, was present at the post-mortem and doesn't appear to have asked anyone to leave. And from reading his statement, there's no sense that he was concerned by the presence of police officers. Does that concern or surprise you?
Well, it really is the same answer I've already given, which is I don't think the police had a role there, and had I been aware of it, I'd have asked them to leave. I would have made sure they left. And the reason for that is to protect the sanctity of the investigation, as potentially Police Scotland were accused here.
And I'm just wondering whether Mr. Ablett, who effectively attended the autopsy at your request on your behalf, whether you would have expected the same of him, that if he'd realised that police officers were there, might you have expected him to challenge that, to ask them to leave, or perhaps even to give you a call if he was unsure?
Well, indeed, yes. Both of those things.
Thank you. Can I move on briefly to another matter, and it concerns organ retention? I wonder if we can look at Mr. Ablett's statement. It's SBPI 00370. And can we look at paragraph 56, please? So he was referred to Dr. Buhaider's statement, that was the second pathologist. Dr. Buhaider states the Fiscal would inform the family that the brain had been retained. I've been asked whether I advised the family of the details of the post-mortem examination. I did not attempt to make contact with the family immediately after the post-mortem to advise them of the post-mortem or to provide them with information about organ retention. I had not been tasked with the duties of family liaison. At that stage, the flows deployed by PERC were responsible for keeping the family updated. Their first task would be to speak with the family and develop a communication strategy, agreeing what information the family would want to be told, how much detail they would want to hear, e.g. did they want to hear the details of the post-mortem examination? Would the family expect regular updates, or would they wish to be contacted only when there was something significant to tell them? Which family member would be the primary point of contact? The effect of losing a loved one can be devastating for a family. Hearing details about the post-mortem examination could be extremely upsetting. The retention of the brain would very likely cause further distress, even in circumstances where it was necessary to retain the brain for examination. The flows would require to deal with the issue of communicating details of the post-mortem examination and organ retention sensitively, and communication with the family could only be in accordance with the family's wishes. Now, can you help me to understand that where an organ has been retained following an autopsy, given that the examination is directed by the Crown, whose responsibility is it to tell the family the organ has been retained?
It very much depends on the nature of the examination. So in a cause of death coronial type post-mortem, that information would be communicated directly by SFIU staff, who would advise the family of the retention and the purpose in retaining. That said, very, very rarely would there be FLOs involved in those cases. We would also utilise our VIA staff to communicate that kind of information and give the family explanations. It has to be said that very few organs are retained for any length of time, and we don't classify a retention as, say, for example, removing the brain and having it examined on the day following or a couple of days following before it's placed back with the body and the body is released. We talk about retention where we take an organ or a part of an organ and we keep that for a longer period of time for particular investigations to be done. So, for example, it's not infrequent in paediatric cases that there might be a cardiac issue and it requires specialist paediatric cardiac examination. That takes months. So we will tell the family that we have retained the heart, and generally speaking, in those circumstances, of course, parents are quite happy with that because they want to know what has happened and are worried about other children or future children. We don't routinely, as I say, speak about retention in something that is separated from the body for a short period of time before being replaced with the body and the body released. So I wouldn't describe this as a retention insofar as my understanding is that the neuropathology was carried out the next day and the brain reunited with the cadaver, and then that Mr. Bayoh's body was ready to be released so far as I was concerned. In homicide-type cases, the pathologist, as they would in every case, will let SFIU know, but the Procurator Fiscal who's present at the postmortem would be aware of the retention. And while I wouldn't anticipate that individual Procurator Fiscal telling the family, I would anticipate that SFIU staff would tell the family, because all issues surrounding retention, release of a body, retention of organs, etc., are routed through SFIU to ensure that there's one route that the pathologist knows is the correct route, because historically we've had difficulties where homicide directed that a body be released when it wasn't in fact ready to be released, and there was a problem because organs were not matched up. So there was one course and one way of dealing with these things. In this situation, we've a post-mortem taking place on the Monday. The information would potentially only get to SFIU on the Tuesday, but they wouldn't even need to do anything with it, because by that stage, the brain would have been returned. And I would anticipate that SFIU East being told that the brain had been removed for the purposes of examination would make inquiry as to whether that had happened and whether the brain was now reunited with the body, because they'd be looking to try and arrange release. So I'm not surprised that Mr. Ablett didn't do anything with it. The process would be that it would go through SFIU. But as I say, in this instance, events would have overtaken the need to do anything because the brain would have been returned.
And you say that you anticipated the brain being returned on the 5th?
Well, my last involvement in this was to seek to, or to speak to Dr. Shearer about the neuropathology. She advised me it had been done early that morning, I think somewhere about 6 o'clock that morning, by Dr. Colin Smith, now Professor Smith. He was going abroad to some medical meeting or another, and he had come in early, carried out the neuropath examination. So my expectation was that the mortuary technicians would have reunited the brain with the body at that time. That's normal practice.
There is evidence before the inquiry. We don't need to go to this form, but the reference is WIT 00052. It's an organ retention form, and it tends to suggest that the brain wasn't reunited with the body until the 8th of May.
I have to say that surprises me, but I don't know whether the brain was taken from the Lawn Market where the Edinburgh City mortuary is, and taken to Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, where Dr. Smith is generally based, dealt with by him on the 5th, and then took some time to process back. The organ retention form is simply a way of ensuring that the fiscal is aware that an organ has been taken out of the body, so that the fiscal can be assured at the time the body is returned that either A, the organs have been replaced, or B, the family have been made aware that there's a retention and those matters have been discussed with them.
Well, we may look at that form after lunch, but I'm mindful that it's now shortly after 1 o'clock. I wonder if this is a...
We'll stop for lunch and sit at 2 o'clock.